Loud. All right. Well, welcome to the Mission Presbytery. And I represent the Synod of the Sun Synod Partnership for Disaster Recovery. That's a mouthful, as you've heard. And we are here to talk about disaster readiness as we anticipate another hurricane season. So grateful for the Mission Presbytery Task Force and Mission Presbytery members for joining together for this important conversation. I'd love to open our time together in prayer. So let us pray. Holy God, you are a God who creates order out of chaos. You are a God of peace, a God of wholeness and reconciliation. As we spend this time talking about the events and possibilities and the many ways that our lives can be shattered and broken, we are so mindful of your magnitude. We're mindful and hopeful for your faithfulness in our lives, your consistency in guiding us and drawing us back together and making us new again. So be with us in this time and guide our conversation and our hearts in this place. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. Can we all see? Everybody sees my screen? Yes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I see you. You're not screen sharing at the
Not
moment.
screening? Oh, that's what I wanted to ask. Thank you. Okay. Screen share. Let's see. Let's go with this one. All right. Do you see the PowerPoint now? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Jen and I discussed, I have too many windows open, so I need help. Okay. So what we're going to cover today is some introductions to the Mission Presbytery, what used to be, I believe, a committee. Is that right? Is now a task force.
Mhm.
So what does that mean? What do they do? As I mentioned, my name is Kathy Lee Cornell. I serve with a fairly newish, new in the last 3-4 years in Presbytery world. It's brand spanking new. The Synod Partnership for Disaster Recovery. We're going to spend some time doing a few tabletop exercises together, talking through some scenarios that you may or may not have seen and what we could do with our congregations, what we ought to do as a presbytery in the synod, and then debriefing that conversation and then having a time of Q&A and a time of prayer to wrap us up. So with that, I'd love for us to go around. I'll close the screen in a minute so we're not looking at tiny versions of ourselves, but I'd love to know, tell us who you are, tell us what church you tend to worship with, and what you are hoping to get out of this conversation. So let me stop this screen sharing, and I'm just gonna bounce around my screen. And Joanne, you're not on our task force, so we'd love to hear from you and tell us what church you're with and what brought you here today.
Well, what brought me is because Ben did an announcement or a report at our general council meeting on Saturday. And I thought I want to learn about this. And of course, it was in the newsletter too. I am a retired director of spiritual formation. And the last church we served was in Pasadena, Texas. And that's where we knew Alex. Yeah. So we were colleagues there. But we've been retired for 7 years, and currently I'm a member of Presbyterian Church of Lake Travis. But Jim and I also serve on the board of Presbyterian Pan American School. So I'm kind of looking at this as that. We'll have a board meeting next week and graduation. So I want to bring some information to the board for Pan Am.
I'm glad you're here. I just had a conversation with our synod leader, I believe, about Pan Am and a couple of ideas that I have.
Okay.
So yes, I'd love to talk about how we can get students more involved, and there's lots of different ways. Maybe a trip for students to do some hands-on disaster work too. Um, so yeah, I'm glad you're here. Thanks for
Okay,
joining
I'm
us.
glad to be here. Thanks for the
Yeah.
invitation.
I'm going to pick on the non-task force folks first, and then I'll let the task force talk. Lori, oh, she's busy.
No, no, no.
No, she-
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm Laurie Palmer. I'm the state clerk of Mission Presbytery. I worship at different churches. My husband is a ruling elder at Madison Square Presbyterian Church in downtown San Antonio, so I go there sometimes. Crossroads is another place I go. I need to make an appearance at University Presbyterian Church to see Laura East. And so I go different places. I grew up in Baton Rouge and I lived 10 years in Florida and I just want to learn because I know about hurricanes. I also am looking forward to Bobby Mazingwa, who is going to be the transitional presbyter, be involved in some way because his church, Maximo Presbyterian Church in St. Petersburg, Florida, flooded there were two hurricanes, one right after the other last year. And for the first time, he's been there 20 years. And for the first time, the church was flooded. So I think he'll have an interest also in this. So that's me.
Thanks, Lori. Daniel, I don't know if you're able to talk and interact with us, but we'd love to welcome you and hear from you if you are available.
Thank you, Kathy. Yes, I am available, and I appreciate you having me, opening the invitation to the broader teams and members at other congregations. I am a member of Primera Iglesia in Brownsville, Texas. I am serving as the treasurer as well as I'm a deacon. So is something of great interest as well. You know, we are not only on the border, but certainly in an area that is prone to hurricanes. And other events, of course, that we want to be able to better prepare for, and knowing that Mission Presbytery and the broader organization is able to support and has structure is certainly something we want to become better aware of and work to support wherever necessary. So thank you, Kathy.
Thanks so much. We're so glad that you're with us. I believe,
Thank you.
Ben, did the flood buckets that you had Paul drive down, did those go to Brownsville for distribution?
Yes, they did. They
Yeah.
went to Cameron County Emergency Management.
Yes, thank you. We've heard. Thank you very much.
Oh, good. You're welcome.
Thank you, Ben.
Well, it's good to know who's down there. So when we were, it took us a little bit to figure out where our buckets were located,
Yes.
how we can get them down, who can get them down, and who can receive them. So that's the work that this task force does. So, but we're glad to know that
Thank you so
you and
much.
your congregation are interested in supporting this work.
Thank you, Kathy.
I'm going to pick on John since John is newest to our task force. John, tell us more about you.
Thank you, Kathy. So I'm not even sure I'm on the task force. I think I went to like a meeting, you know, Ben sent me the invitation after we connected, but glad to be here. So I am a member of Hope Presbyterian up in Austin. I'm actually an elder there, ruling elder. But I live in San Antonio, and when I'm down here, I worship at Covenant Presbyterian, which is about a quarter mile from my house. The way I got interested in the disaster assistance and preparedness is we are up at Hope looking at revitalizing or sort of energizing disaster preparedness on our campus. and currently doing a lot of information gathering and discernment about different roles that Hope could play. I mean, besides just, hardening the campus itself, as a preventative measure, but also trying to figure out what kind of role we could play in the community, helping the community prepare and then, mitigate disasters and things like that. But also roles we could take in, a member of Presbytery and some of the efforts that Presbytery undertakes. We've done a lot of stuff in the past. I mean, brought Boy Scout trailers full of fans and buckets and stuff down to Louisiana after hurricanes, and bought a bunch of stuff through our own internal grant process for Presbytery, like chainsaws and things like that. But because of COVID, that had sort of slackened off a little bit, and so we're looking at like I said, re-energizing or revitalizing that. So that's how I ended up here.
Thanks, John. We're happy to have you on the task force if you so wish to join.
Hey, John, we live fairly close to each other, by the way. Just FYI. Yeah.
Castle Hills.
Well, I live not quite, just a little bit outside of it, but yeah,
Okay.
pretty close.
Me too.
Oh, well, Sandra, while you're on, you're the next newest. So Sandra, tell us who you are.
Well, I'm Sandra Murray, and I'm honorably retired, but then I don't always stay retired. So I'm currently a chaplain with a hospice here in San Antonio. And I attend Oak Hills Presbyterian Church. And while they're in transition, looking for a new pastor, forming their pastor nominating committee and all of that, I am moderating session, and I preach usually once a month. We do a little rotation. We've got a couple of retired clergy types in the congregation, so trying to add some continuity for the congregation. My interest in disaster preparedness comes from my experience in 1992 in after Hurricane Andrew. I served a small congregation in Homestead, Florida, and we had, I worked with disaster preparedness, as they called it in those days, quite closely. And so I have quite a desire to help people to be prepared as you can be prepared for something like a hurricane, but tornadoes, all of the things that can be disasters in a congregation. I think that's enough for right now.
Well, you were muted, Kathy, but I think it looked like Jen, so I'm going to go.
Yes.
My name is Jennifer Rektrick. I live down in the Rio Grande Valley. My church, First Presbyterian Wesco, closed at the end of last year, so I am currently deciding which congregation to join next. But one of the things that I particularly like about serving on this task force and participating in Presbytery is, even though my church closed and that's been really hard, I know people at basically all of the Presbyterian churches in the Valley. And so I think that connectional aspect is really important in the community. And part of disaster preparedness and relief is those connections and the community so that we can support each other through hard times. I joined this, it was a committee. I joined the task force in 2018. My house flooded. My city has had 4 flooding events in 10 years. Only one was caused by a hurricane, and that includes the one at the end of March. So, and the big one in 2018, our church suddenly became a hub for donated clothing, and we scrambled to find volunteers and to help the 2,000 homes that were affected in that flood get clothing so that they could get by. That was something that we were able to do pretty quickly, and but we weren't prepared really for that event at all, right? So I think preparedness is really important. And again, those connections in that community and knowing where to go to get help, or things that you may not have even thought of, and preparing for a disaster. So I think trainings like this and talking things out are really important.
I'm muted.
You're-
Thank you, Jen. All right, Ben, I'm going to have you introduce yourself and then introduce us to the task force.
Okay, I'm Ben Henderson, live in San Antonio. I'm attending University Presbyterian Church for approximately 8 years now, and previous to that, San Pedro Presbyterian for maybe 20 years. Previously lived many years ago in Florida, and actually I went through a hurricane in the early 1970s there. Later in my career, more recent in 2008, I happened to be in the Cedar Rapids, Iowa market at the time, living and working when they had the extreme flooding of the city, which nearly brought down all city facilities and government offices there. So I've been through a couple of casualties. I worked on a mayor's commission there to help rebuild some affordable housing, which in my profession, I've dealt with multifamily. So in a way, I've always looked at what could potentially happen. What's the risk at any multifamily property if it gets hit by a disaster? And just the whole process of assessing damage, estimating cost, trying to react in the proper sequence and get things rebuilt has been a very keen interest of mine, just to try and make things work again, put it back together. I've been involved with the disaster preparedness group since 2017, where my own church began to assess its own risks on site for potential damages that might occur to University Presbyterian. We're located adjacent to Trinity University. And so we not only assessed our risk, but then we began to think of our position adjacent to the Trinity campus and the school being there with students, potential events that might happen there, how to coordinate with the private Trinity police force that's on site in case there were events, as well as to interact with police and fire in the greater San Antonio area. We then got involved with the DPA, writing a set of standards for churches to follow in terms of preparing their own disaster preparedness plans and to advise their congregation as to what might be done to react and have the proper channels to do so. The disaster preparedness group also has equipment stored at Mo Ranch, and we have deployed some equipment from there, such as generators. We have shower trailers, chainsaws are now at John Knox Ranch. We will eventually store one trailer and one shower shed at John Knox. And for deployment of disaster hygiene kits or cleanup buckets, we've positioned those at approximately 6 different locations around the state or in our presbytery for just holding those, having churches participate with us to assemble those ingredients that go into a cleanup bucket, put those together sometimes with congregation members or their youth groups, and get involvement from really the grassroots level at each church to prepare and help ready the presbytery to be responsive in times of disaster. And the most recent example was the deployment of some cleanup buckets and hygiene kits down to Cameron County. Beyond that, I think one of the most important functions, as I said earlier, was the preparation of the materials that would help guide a church, because we modeled our work after a very extensive documentation that had been done in the state of Florida for disaster preparedness, and made that more aligned to our own situation and our own geographic region here in Texas. And we're still actually working on that. Where can we deploy equipment? How can we react best? Who can we interact with? And that includes the local VOAD here in San Antonio. Previously, there was a VOAD group in Austin. There is now a long-term recovery group in the Valley, Rio Grande Valley, that not only reacts to disasters, but takes the much longer multi-year outlook of helping to rebuild. And so to the extent that we can help those organizations, or help our churches, or get our churches involved in those efforts of the local communities, that's what we're here for, is to provide those details and information to them.
Thanks, Ben. And I think it's important to note that part of the transition from this team from being a committee to a task force is to give you some nimbleness in how you operate. So like someone like John doesn't have to wait until there's a nominating committee that nominates members who have certain skill sets that represent a certain, geographical area, but we can bring people on the team as needed to help support the work of this team. So there is a bit of sort of nimbleness that's involved with being a task force underneath Mission Presbytery that I think is a gift to this team, especially when we have a really broad scope of things we could respond to and things that we're able to do. And so most recently, Ben has worked on getting the shower trailer ready out at Mo Ranch, that a team of youth groups that are doing mission trip work in disaster recovery will use the shower trailer this summer. So that's an example of things that this team can do, as well as to talk to your church leadership about your plan. So I just did an insurance webinar today with my presbytery in South Louisiana. And the state clerk said that, a lot of the things that we could do as a church to bring down the cost of insurance, which is really high right now, is free. And because a lot of the things we could do is to create policies that mitigate risk. So when you have those policies in place, like a disaster plan, like, just a general property maintenance plan, this can help drive down some of the rising cost of property insurance premiums. So I'll introduce myself really quickly and just so we can dive into our topic for the day. I represent the Synod. The Synod is made up of 11 presbyteries, Mission Presbytery being one of those. And we cover 4 states, Texas, Louisiana. I live in Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. And if you think about last year, I believe we had somewhere between 30 or so billion-dollar disaster events, things that cost $1 billion to recover in our U.S. economy. 1 in 3 of those happened within the Synod of the Sun. And so the wisdom and the leadership between the presbyteries with the Synod and our national office, which we know as PDA, Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, said, why don't we work together on this on a Synod level? Because if you've seen a Mission Presbytery after Hurricane Harvey, you had this really robust response. But as we've seen the disaster cycle start to spin pretty quickly, that the attention and the resources after one disaster can quickly dwindle when you've got another hurricane or another wildfire or another tornado. And so rather than making each presbytery responsible for the disaster coordination happening within their presbytery, what if we shared this resource so we can work together? And so something we talk about a lot in the disaster partnership world are the 4 C's: cooperation, communication, coordination, and collaboration. And so part of my role is, how do we get our 11 presbyteries to work together? So for example, last year's Hurricane Beryl we thought it was coming to Mission Presbytery, and you were great about sending notices out there, letting people know to, check in on your people, lock down your buildings. And it went and hit your neighbor Presbytery New Covenant. I called a pastor down in Bay City, Texas, and said, could you use a generator? And he said, could I? I've been living days without air conditioning. And this was what, July? And so Ben and I and other folks called. My husband, Alex, happened to be at Mo Ranch with the youth group. And I said, Alex, you got to find a team that's driving back towards Houston so they can pull the generator. So Mo Ranch lent their trailer, your team lent your generator, the Woodland Hills Presbyterian Church youth group were so patient and waiting for us to get this generator in order so it could get down to Bay City and alleviate this poor pastor. And then he quickly turned around and opened up the church to welcome a disaster relief group. I believe for like 6 weeks that their church building hosted teams of disaster relief group that went out and did the debris removal, chainsaw work, getting trees off of property. So this is the kind of thing that we can do together. And so part of my role is to have eyes on all the presbyteries and try to help each other connect when there is a need. And so that's what we do as the Synod. Any questions on that?
I just wanted to, one thing I forgot to mention, and I didn't think I heard you say it. I'm the Presbytery, Mission Presbytery liaison to the Synod disaster. All the presbyteries have a liaison to the Synod, and I'm a part of that group. I forgot to mention that, and that's a very important thing. So.
Thanks, Sandra. And I wrote it down here and I forgot to read my own handwriting. So Sandra, liaison. So there is a liaison that's a non-staff person, and it's not Ben because Ben is chairing your team. So another person, another leadership position. So each of the 11 presbyteries has a representative. We meet quarterly online to share updates, to problem solve together, so that there is a quarterly gathering of our 11 presbyteries together. And last fall, we had our first in-person retreat to really dream big. This is a really new partnership in the Synod, and this is the last year of this pilot program, and we're renewing it hopefully for the next 5 years. So we love to keep it going, but Sandra has stepped up to be the liaison representing Mission Presbytery. So thank you, Sandra. I just want to highlight that in 2025, you've already seen some major events. We've worked really hard to respond to the flooding in the Rio Grande Valley. You've had the wildfires. This is just one of the wildfires in the area. We haven't had to respond to anything with this fire, but just to know that conditions are ripe, and then we're transitioning into hurricane season. And so although last year, as I look through all the events that have happened across the Synod, your presbytery actually got off pretty scotch-free last year, which is praise the Lord, amen. And we hope for the same this year. But we know that we've got to be prepared. So this is just sort of an anticipation of what has already happened this year and what we're preparing for in the coming months. So now I want to transition into thank you. I'm not sharing slides. Thanks, John. I see it on my screen. Thank you for that reminder. Okay, so let me go back. Can y'all see this? Okay, these are Synod of the Sun, 4Cs, a partnership, and I can resend the slides out afterwards, so don't feel like you have to catch anything you missed. Things we've had. tabletop exercises. This is when you do want to see your screen. So we're going to have discussion. We're all going to get off of mute. We're going to talk about some things. And so what I want you to take away from this process is that this is something that you can do in your church, just this exercise. I picked up my 5-year-old today from daycare, and his note said that they practiced a fire drill. And I said, Gabe, did you practice a fire drill? And he goes, and a tornado drill. So if our 5-year-olds are practicing fire drills and tornado drills, I'm baffled that in my 40 years of attending church, I've never done a fire drill at our church. I've never done a tornado drill at our church. And I think these are things that we might ought to think about. Should we be doing this as a congregation? So these are exercises, and these are just things that I've made up. You can Google and find all kinds of tabletop exercises. And if you take some time, whether it's officer training, a congregational meeting, do a Wednesday night supper where you talk about these things as a church to help guide your policies and processes as a church. These are things that will help you. So we're going to discuss a scenario. We're going to share how we communicate across our congregations, and also who do you talk to in the presbytery. There may be times that I get a call and the presbytery doesn't know about it. And Lori's shaking her head, and Lori would love to know if something has happened in your church.
And also, I guess I should lift up at some point that the presbytery staff has a plan,
Mhm.
has a disaster plan for communication. But yeah.
And we'll talk about it, sometimes if there's a widespread communication outage,
Mhm.
and just to anticipate, hey, we're gonna wait 48 hours, don't feel the need to call in because you're probably taking care of your family and your pets and your loved ones. But within 48 hours, if we can communicate, check in with us. So how do you communicate with each other? Decide what coordinated action needs to take place. Is this something you have the capacity and the resources to act on? If not, who does have the capacity and the resources to act on it? And then at the end of this, if we can take away, I like to do, what are 3 things you can take away? We can't solve it all. We can't do it all. And that's okay. I feel like I think about Jesus didn't heal every sick person, but Jesus did heal some people. So we can't solve all the problems, but we can identify some problems that we're willing to address. So I'm going to kick it to Jen, who's going to lead us in our first scenario.
Okay, so your church is hosting the Presbytery Women Retreat for all the PWs in the Presbytery. So this is a big gathering because it's for the whole Presbytery. A church member calls you to tell you there has been a case of measles reported at their child's school. This family was in worship this past Sunday. So you've got this call, you have this big gathering coming up from people who are traveling in to attend. How do you discern whether or not to proceed with the gathering? Who are the decision makers in this case? So feel free to chime in. I was thinking about measles. And so one of the good things is we know a lot about this disease, and that information is easy to Google. The CDC website talks about, this is one of the most contagious diseases known to mankind. 90% of people who are not immune will get it if they are exposed. People are contagious 4 days before symptoms appear and 4 days after the rash appears. But we also have data on the immunity. So where we've seen the outbreaks in West Texas is where the percentage of immunity is below that. I think it's like 95%. So that's also something that you can look up for your area to see if you're in an area that may be below that immunity rate. So we have a lot of information that is available. But it can be really difficult to say, well, here's the data and we have this exposure, and was that enough exposure to be worried about? So who's going to be making this decision in your church about whether you're going to proceed with this meeting?
I guess it would be the Presbyterian Women's Group with the session.
Mhm.
I would hope that they would at least, come together to discuss it.
So then, of course, the people at the local congregation need to communicate with Presbytery women and the people who are helping to organize the event.
If it were COVID in 2020, I would say all bets are off, don't do it. But I'm more inclined on this one to go communicate, and, let people decide what they're going to do.
And I think something we've learned from COVID, like I would never want to redo COVID, but I think we've learned a lot from COVID. I think that taught us a lot about how we can host gatherings safely when there is, an issue of some disease going around. So could you do a hybrid version, right? Could you mitigate some of the risks that, maybe it's a small, instead of having large group gatherings, can you do it in small pods in other locations? So there are precautionary things we can do, rather than going wholesale, like cancel, you cannot put on this gathering. What are some ways? So an example is Tres Rios Presbytery, which is your other neighboring presbytery. They had a presbytery meeting in an area with the measles outbreak in Seminole, Texas. And so they transitioned to hybrid presbytery meeting. It's not fun, but we practiced it. And so it's not, folks have means to get on online and do some sort of gathering. So that's an example of a precautionary measures.
So thanks, Kathy. That goes to the second question. Are there any precautionary measures you can take as a congregation? So are there any other precautionary measures that we could take?
I think, anytime a church hosts something like this, it's that significant. You always line up a number of volunteers and things like that. And for something like measles, which you're basically immune to after you've been vaccinated, you could make sure that nobody that from your congregation is volunteering that hasn't been vaccinated for the measles. That was like a triple negative, but just make sure all the people that are going to participate or volunteer have been vaccinated.
But again, that goes down to the communication, as Lori brought up too,
Yep.
right? Communication is really important to say that this has happened. So that, precautionary measures. I think Lori mentioned that the Presbytery has a disaster communication plan. So a measles outbreak isn't the only disaster that could befall a congregation. And once the disaster's already happened, being able to get the word out quickly is really important, right? Regardless of what it is. So precautionary measures, even besides this PW gathering, having that communication plan in place to say, oh, well, we had an incident and here's how we can communicate. And of course, it would be a little bit different because you are having this event. So contacting the Presbyterian women and, keeping in mind everyone who needs to be informed.
One thing in advance also might be, I've assumed I'm immune because I had a very strong case as a child, but I'm also 72 years old, and a friend of mine assumed she was immune, and she had, I guess it was a blood test, and her immunity is not there anymore. And so I don't know, just kind of letting people know before anything would happen. The question is, are you immune as we go out and about in our world, whether we were hosting the event, just to bring that up, to not assume that we've got the immunities, and our children would be, because it's been more recent. But I don't know, that could be something that a church might encourage people to at least look into. I don't know.
Yeah, since we know that there are these outbreaks, and I've heard of that same thing, someone who had the vaccine or was exposed as a kid, but they're not actually immune anymore, right? So sharing of information well before this event, can have an impact too. So we talked about the plan to communicate with the staff, the congregation, and the presbytery. But of course, it's also everybody who's coming to the event. So how do you think would be the best way to communicate what has happened?
I have a couple of thoughts about that. First of all, your communication needs to have a designated person. You need to know as a group which person in the organization is going to make decisions, which person is going to communicate key information to the group or to external audiences outside the group. And second thing is just having ready a list of everybody that would need to be contacted. And that's one of the aspects of our disaster preparedness plan document, is to help churches have those lists of their congregation members, lists of fire, police, other organizations that would need to be contacted. Who do you want to communicate with immediately? What's that chain of communication to be followed? And just having that ready when anything happens is that most of the work is already done.
I think, Ben, you also raised an interesting point alongside, closely linked to, communicating, is making decisions. And, look, we're on a task force now, and so the Presbyterians are great at establishing committees and task force and stuff like that. But sometimes, there has to be, extraordinary decision making that's done either, centralized because of time, or sometimes diffused out more broadly because of things like liability. And so I think that's an aspect, besides how are you communicating, but it's, who's making the decisions about what's communicated and with who, or with whom, I guess, in a lot of these scenarios.
Yeah, my my mother-in-law was just in town this past weekend, and she worships at a church in Atlanta, and the church admin sent out an email on behalf of something like PW, like the Women's Bible Study Group. And the admin put in a link to buy the book from Amazon. Well, one of the ladies in charge replied all.
Oh, no.
Did not appreciate the addition of the link to Amazon and wanted to be clear that you can buy your book from any place. But that's an example of like who has the authority to communicate. And so I would say designating this is your, director of communication and between PW and the congregation to agree upon what messaging is going out. Because if something happened, if somebody got fatally sick and decided to sue the church, they're going to want that documentation to say, we had this messaging, to sort of you're going to hold the church harmless if something happened, but and to have it at both fronts, so it's so it's very clear and documented, and many eyes have been on it.
And even in a small church, our church is relatively small, or it's small. We can make lists and, plans and all that, but if people don't know where that is, I mean, somehow it's not just the session or just the pastor or the director of communication would know, but the rest of us need to know who is the director of communication, that we even have one. So that, again, it goes back to communication and where would I find that list, and where would I find our action items and whatever that is. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because someone might say, oh yeah, I emailed that to you 3 months ago. So
Yes.
now you're trying to find that in your email. Yeah, having that information easily accessible and knowing where it is and knowing who the point person is really key. And not just for this event, but for everything that your church does.
Yeah, and that gets down to just real basic, like having a printed copy, having a copy on your server, perhaps storing another safe copy out on Google Drive, um, having redundant copies, in other words, so that those materials are accessible, where you can find it real quick. And even if the server is destroyed, that you put it onto, you've got another source you can go to, like Google.
Yeah.
And that's what we do with ours, Ben, at the Presbytery, is we all have one at home. Hopefully everybody knows where it is. We all have one in our office. It's on the Google Drive. So, yeah. Spread it out.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think it's also important when this Presbyterian Women Retreat was planned and a lot of work went into it. So you want to make sure that whenever you're planning something, that part of that discussion includes not just like what will happen if everything goes right, but how to make sure you have that plan in place if something happens, a medical emergency, a measles outbreak. I've been to events where we had a tornado warning in the middle of an event and everybody's there. You're like, so you hope that things won't happen, but even just putting that on the agenda to make sure that it's considered can be really beneficial in case something does happen. And you have that communication plan and that knowledge of the committee is there to move forward with. What support would be helpful to you in the congregation? And Kathy, I'm not sure if you meant support from outside the congregation. Yeah, so from the Presbytery, from Presbyterian Women, from this task force, what support would you be looking for if your church was planning this event and suddenly this happened?
I mean, Presbytery could probably help with communication for sure. I mean, there might be folks that are traveling or getting ready to travel, and they might not be on their email or something. Maybe Presbytery has more broad ways of communicating if it's a Presbytery or a Presbytery wide meeting. Like the church wouldn't normally have people that are attending in some of their distribution lists, maybe.
Kathy, piggybacking on what John said, do churches use text, a mass text communication tool for something like that? Do you know of any?
Uh-huh.
Oh, you do?
There's
Okay.
flock notes.
Okay. Okay. That's what it's called?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. We don't have that at Mission Presbytery, and I think it would be a good thing at least to have pastors and maybe the clerks of sessions on something like that. I guess I'm not talking measles, I'm talking something else.
Yeah.
But
I think that's a great idea because usually those services have some cost
Right.
associated
Yeah.
with it. And for big events like the Presbyterian Women Retreat, it's not just saying, oh, there was a measles exposure, but saying, updates on anything that happened with the event, and people who registered for that event could be added to that list. And that's a great way to communicate quickly because people don't always check their email quickly, right? If there was something, we're not going to be able to start on time, or, make sure you do this before the event. And to have that system already in place. That would be a great way, I think, that the Presbytery could support, because those sorts of paid services, churches either don't think about it, or, maybe it's not in the budget. Yeah, that's a great idea.
I think because this is health related, you would want to have medical departments, health department resources available. And In fact, if I recall correctly, our disaster preparedness guidelines, we had a brief section on pandemic. And even though we wrote that in something like 2018 or 19, not having gone through a pandemic, sure enough, one came
Yeah,
along.
that we wrote that before the COVID pandemic, and I don't know, we should probably
That's right.
revisit. I would think we all learned a lot from that event.
Well, our basic advice in the document, I think, was to just simply follow the guidelines of the local health department.
Yeah.
And as it turns out, that's what people were doing in 2020 and 21, was looking up every day to see the number of COVID cases, and retention and deaths and so forth.
Yeah.
So at least, it was a advisement on how to follow certain agencies, and that in this case of measles, you'd want to be able to go to the authorities that know the most about measles.
Yeah, so of course, if there's been an outbreak in your county health department would hopefully have resources and have somebody who's working on the situation so that you could contact.
Right.
And of course, the CDC website, at least currently, has a lot of information about measles and how it spreads and who's the most vulnerable, which is can be used as a resource too.
Thank you, Jen. Thanks for facilitating this thought exercise. So the next one, most of us, I think, have had some experience with, but it doesn't hurt to cover it since we are heading into hurricane season. But rather than the preventative side, we're going to look at how do we respond to hurricanes. So Sandra, I'm going to let you take this one on.
Okay. Hurricane Hope made landfall 48 hours ago. The majority of the community is without power, and the heat index is extremely high. Miraculously, the church building has minimal damage and the electricity works. How will you discern the church's response to this hurricane? And who are the decision makers? But how would you discern the church's response to this hurricane?
Well, I think among the session, the elders, the leaders of the church, one quick decision you want to make is whether or not you can open up the building, maybe allow it to become a resource for people who need a place to go, who need electricity to charge phones and so forth. The decision makers are going to be the pastor. Maybe if your office has an administrative employee, that individual. If there's a school on site, you're going to have a school administrator also. You got to think about the students and what activity you're trying to conduct at your church property other than just church on Sunday. Maybe something else going on there.
Yeah, those good points.
So hopefully, you're part of the community and you've thought about who do we need to talk to when something like this happens? Who in your community would you contact and say, hey, our church has electricity. What do you need, right? Is it your local emergency response team, the fire station? Knowing that ahead of time is really helpful and important, because when you're building those relationships and who to call and say, what is really needed right now. So maybe just being a place for people to come and cool down, but knowing who to contact and see how you can help with the resources that you have would be really critical at that point, so that the decision makers can say, this is how we're going to proceed. And it's filling a need for the community at that point.
Yes, thank you. Any other ideas?
Well, just to have as a thought that the normal people, not the normal people, but the people that we've listed as the decision makers, sometimes, at least in Harvey, some of those people also were, their homes were flooded and damaged. They weren't in a position, they needed help. They weren't in a position to, so we needed to have a backup plan. I mean, our home had some damage, but it wasn't, it didn't stop us from doing things, but there were a lot of people who had it, up 5 feet or 3 feet in their houses. And so what do we do when the normal people that we would usually, just to think about that in advance would be helpful. And then there was the danger of, down lines, trees in the way, all of that. So, what do we do? What do we do? How do we get to the people? That was an issue for us. But opening the church I don't think we had power for at first, but when we opened the church for people to come rest and to charge once we got power was very important. If they could get there.
Yeah, I know. I remember that my congregation in Homestead was very small, but they made a concerted effort to reach out to every person in the congregation to see who might need additional help, and almost everybody needed something. And then all of the FEMA and the National Guard and all kinds of other groups came in and helped. We didn't have a building per se because it was they were worshiping in homes when I first came there. So they eventually rented a space, but so there was a disruption for the church. There was a disruption for all the members and all the community. And we just worked together with all of the different groups that came in, but we didn't have any plan. Well, I came into it in the middle of it, but they didn't have a plan because a hurricane hadn't hit Homestead since 1936 or something like that. So they had no plan. So that tells me that it's very important to have a plan. So.
I think, there's another aspect maybe to this as well, like that last sentence that talks about miraculously the church, minimal damage and electricity works. I mean, maybe that church could serve as sort of a hub or a collection and distribution point for aid coming in from outside, within, like any kind of stuff arranged by the Presbytery or the Synod, they could go there and it could be a distribution point for around the community. I remember when we brought stuff down from Austin into Louisiana, it was sort of a more rural area and there wasn't really a church close by. So we dropped all our stuff off at, I think it was the FEMA or the National Guard emergency response location. And then they distributed it. But if the church is up and running, it could be a cooling place or a distribution center, places where people can go and charge stuff up off the grid, something like that.
Yeah, John, you named a lot of possibilities. One, a cooling center. Two, a point of distribution for resources. There's another acronym out there, MARC, a multi-agency resource center. So a place where many of the agencies can line up and disaster survivors can come and visit each one without having to go out to individual offices. That's another one. You could be a Red Cross shelter. We had a church in Clear Lake, actually, Clear Lake Presbyterian Church became a Red Cross shelter during Hurricane Beryl. So there's many different possibilities for the ways your church can be used. And so I want to introduce another acronym, VOAD. Some of y'all are familiar with this acronym, Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters. This group will come together, that we come together throughout the year, but when a disaster happens, we'll come together immediately to coordinate. And your VOAD will bring together Red Cross, Salvation Army, your local emergency management offices on the state and county level. And when they say, hey, we do need a site for one of these things, this is where you can offer the church. Like Joanne said, maybe your people aren't available to serve because they're taking care of their homes, but you can at least offer up the church building for other agencies to come in and use it as a resource.
Okay, thank you. Any other thoughts on that first two questions? Okay, are there any precautionary measures you can take as a congregation? I already pointed out that you need to have a plan.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's probably a number of things you can do with, physically hardening your facilities, to make if the product, you can get a generator, so you can keep the power on. I mean, this church sounds like it was lucky. There's, things you can do for drainage on your property, all kinds. I'm sure there's a checklist out there somewhere. But if hurricanes are a specific thing, there's certain measures you can take to harden your buildings and make them a little more survivable.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things for precautions, just that I do in my own home, and this is something we've encouraged with our congregation to prepare for hurricane season, because that's where we live, is to just have your supplies ready to go. And so that's not just, your supplies, your own personal water supply and your own personal food, but my brother, his mother-in-law's house flooded at the end of March. We got a big storm that came through the valley and her house flooded. And I had all of my flood cleanup supplies already at my house. So we didn't have to go and fight at the store for everybody else who's trying to clean up their flooded properties. I had a bucket of my own ready to go. I had dehumidifiers ready to go. So if this is already an issue where your church is located, every year checking on your emergency supplies for your church in case that this does happen, and you need to be able to respond to take care of your congregation and your community.
Thank you. Good points.
Okay,
Adding
what
to
I'm
that-
going to say has nothing to do. Oh, I'm sorry, Joanne.
No, I was just going to say what we ran out of very quickly when we were going to different houses of members, but also people in the neighborhood. Big heavy duty trash bags were not available, and plastic bins were gone within minutes practically. As soon as you could get out, the plastic bins were gone. But it was not just for trash, but for the things that they were salvaging. And so that wouldn't be a big thing for a congregation. I mean, not that we have tons of space, but I could picture congregations during hurricane season well, I guess it'd be true for fires too, but just to have a lot of packages of really, that you could hand to a family, a big thing of the heavy duty, big black, because it was just gone. It was, all of the stores were empty with that. So.
And our church had big trash cans anyway, so we're going to be using trash bags and might as well just stock up, right? So one of the things as a task force that we've worked on is finding churches in each of the 6 regions of our presbytery who can serve as a storage area for cleanup buckets. So these are for flood cleanup, fire cleanup, that sort of thing. They have a lot of cleanup supplies in them. They are expensive to transport. So we wanted to have them in each region so that they could be deployed quickly. So that's a great service project for churches to put together these cleanup buckets or the hygiene kits, and to just have them on hand. We had some on hand. The valley flooded at the end of March. We had buckets that were ready to be sent to where they were needed, and those supplies were already at hand when we know that the stores are going to be out. But I really like the idea, if you don't have the room or the capacity for the buckets, trash bags, you've seen that that's a need after a disaster.
Okay.
So, and they store.
Yeah, thank you. I need to kind of pull us together. There's been some great ideas, and I'm really appreciative of that. Are there any more thoughts on how you might plan to communicate with the staff, congregation, and the presbytery?
I would say same as the previous example.
Mhm. Yeah. Did you have a comment, Joanne? Joanne?
No, just what we've talked about, having some kind of phone or text chain or something.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I think all of those are good ideas, and we need to be in both with the staff and with and people in the congregation, but also with the presbytery and the synod. We've got these supports out there, and we need to find ways to reach out to them as well.
yeah.
Is there any particular support that would be helpful to you and your congregation? That's the last question there.
Well, in a weather-related event such as a hurricane, we here in Texas have Texas Department of Emergency Management. Each county usually has similar office. Major cities, like here in San Antonio, would have an office. The National Weather Service, you'd want to tap in and make sure any recurring storms or tornadoes spinning off of a hurricane might be a threat. The VOADs are a very good source, and they will supply these links to TDEM and other organizations that are monitoring the weather, monitoring resources of help and assistance.
Okay, thank you. I need to turn this back over to Kathy so that we can get to the third scenario. But thank you, all of you, for your insights. Kathy?
Thank you, Sandra. And we'll talk more about resources once we're done with the tabletop exercises, what financial resources are available from the Synod and Presbytery and PDA level. But John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Kathy. So this one hits close to home for me. I mentioned I am an elder up at Hope and Austin, and although we have not had any gun violence and things like that, we do have a large elementary school right across the street from us, at which our pastor's wife is a kindergarten teacher, and we have an active we have a lot of members whose kids go there, and we have an active participation with them in a reading buddies program, which puts a lot of our members over at the school at any given time. So, going through and reading the questions, it sort of drove me thinking about a couple of different options that might be unique to Hope. But basically, the scenario is at a local elementary school, there's a shooting incident. The church gets a call. They do have members and children who attend there. And later it comes out that the incident's being investigated as a hate crime. And so first question, I mean, sort of the same as the other ones, how do you discern the church's response to the shooting, and who are the decision makers?
Would this be a case of less is more? For instance, very intentional people who would respond to this, and very few. Am I making sense? I'm probably not.
No, I think you are, Lori. I mean,
like, everybody don't run to the school. Parents are going to run to the school. Parents are going to run to the school, but church members don't need,
So I think you're right. I mean, it has to be a more measured response. Obviously, people are gonna, I was thinking more along the lines of the first responders are responding to the school,
Right.
whereas the congregation and the leadership might be responding to the church and doing things like, I mean, obviously church things would be normal, you know, prayer vigil, grief counseling by the staff on hand and things like that. But like in Hope's case, we also have a very good relationship with the Travis County Sheriff's Office. Maybe the church becomes a place for the link up, you know, of all of the, you always see the people like on the slide coming out of the church and they're going somewhere. So maybe that the church could serve as a link up point, or, you know, a media center or a response center, depending on how close it is to the, I mean, geographically to the elementary school or something like that. Again, a place where the community could respond to, you know, sort of like in the hurricane example.
When this happened in Uvalde, the pastor there said she wished she had media training
Mm,
because
Uh-huh.
media will descend. And so this is where it's important to think about who has the authority to talk to media. So say someone calls the church and say, we heard that you know, a member of yours is involved, you know, in any which way. Who has the authority to say, you know, no comment, or what kind of statement would you like to make, especially if the church is in a position, you know, depending on what the scenario is, and the church does want to raise a voice for, you know, Christ's love in the world. How do we do that? I'm thinking about El Paso's shooting that happened. We had a shooting in Allen, Texas. I believe that was last year. You know, Asian American community, and a church there did open up 2 weeks later. Again, like Lori said, we don't all need to run to the school, but this is an act that impacts the community. So within 2 weeks' time, there was a Presbyterian church that offered space for those who weren't directly involved, but still wanted a place to process. And they had chaplains, several chaplains come in and help facilitate that conversation.
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, I think those are all good things. Maybe, you know, a lot more of them might be indirect supporter participation over a longer term. You know, like you said, process over time. Are there any precautionary measures you can take as a congregation? And I read this, maybe not cautionary in terms of something like this happening somewhere else, like at the school, but maybe happening at your church, like we've seen as well. And I know over a period of time, Hope has done things like put in secure doors that lead into the office spaces, and we have a child care center in one of our main buildings, or even into, you know, the entry into the narthex, things like that. So that during non-business hours you have to badge in, and even sometimes during that you have to badge in just to control access.
Mm-hmm.
John, you mentioned having like tutoring program, and I think that's something to think about is who keeps a list of which volunteers are at the school. So if you're looking for somebody, right, if this is a time where there's a mass scramble to identify like where your loved ones are, and you're able to say, hey, like we think we do have these 3 members who are volunteering at this time, that will help local authority know who they're looking for when they're trying to identify folks, and then to notify family that yes, like, you know, come down, and so you can be nearby in case we are able to reunite you with your family members. So things like that we can kind of get kind of loosey-goosey about with our partnerships with different organizations, but that's where like sign up sheets help, and communicating, like when I'm also a social worker, but you know, if I go out in the field, I'm texting someone to say, hey, I'm going to go make this home visit. And when I'm done with it, I text someone to let them know that I've wrapped up. That kind of safety check-in with folks.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea, Kathy. And I think, I mean, I know For instance, like if one of our staff, like our facilities manager, is part of the Reading Buddies program, and he'll check out to let him know he's not, being the facilities manager, and now he's back. But that's probably a good idea to, to the degree people want to be tracked. We also have a lot of folks that go down once a week into downtown Austin to do, God's Family Dinner, which is a feeding program for homeless. Again, normally you wouldn't think about wanting to track your people that are down there, but if something were to happen, that's a good way of sort of establishing accountability of where folks are at. It's a good idea.
One of the other precautionary things is just making sure that you have first aid kits and tourniquets available in the church, and you know where they are, and it's not just in one part of the church, and encouraging people to do the Stop the Bleed training.
Yeah, I was just going to say we just had one of those classes. So we've also somebody talked about a fire drill, and I don't know if it was this weekend or probably not next weekend, Mother's Day, but we just had or are planning to have an evacuation drill, not fire drill, shooter drill, whatever, but during worship at some point. Okay, everybody please move to the exits and we'll meet outside, kind of thing, which we'd never had before.
John, did you let the congregation know that it's going to happen at some point so they don't think it's real, or did you let them think it's real?
I'm pretty sure that we let them know.
Yeah.
But for the first time, you want to manage that.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, that's when you find out who carries is in situations like that. Yeah.
Well, so we're one of those churches. It's sort of like we prefer you not to carry inside,
Yes,
but
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, did I cut somebody off? I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say I'm cognizant of our time and I want to get us off to the rest of our evening. But
I think this next one we've sort of, I heard somebody, maybe it was Ben, say same as last one, and on the communication, something like that's probably going to get communicated around the media faster than we could do it. But support, I think that depending on the decisions that the church made to maybe like be a place for dealing over a longer term, maybe some grief counseling and more specialized things like that from Presbytery or Synod or wherever would probably be helpful.
And going back to communication, I'll say I haven't, some folks don't think about automated messaging. And I think when you're overwhelmed with response, right? Like if something happens and you've got colleagues from all over checking in on you, sometimes you got to either pass the phone to somebody else, or it's okay to set up an automated response by email, by phone to say, we're overwhelmed with contacts and please leave a message. We'll get back to you when we can. That it's okay to tell, to train up your leaders and your staff on how to set up an automated messaging system, because sometimes it's just too much, and it's okay to do that. And then we'll talk more about support in the next two slides. But I think what I want us to notice is that when we say same as the last time, if you plan in general for any disasters, it's going to help you. Whether it's a health disaster, it's a mass casualty event, it's a weather disaster, that doing this work for some type of disaster will help you for all the other disasters. That's part of the through line I hope we're getting from this exercise. So what are your next steps? So when we talk about the hot wash is like a time of debriefing, and I think about, categories of what you could do in your church leadership. You can talk about your emergency preparedness plans. You can talk about whether or not your staff and your leadership is prepared. Like today, I worked with a church that had a flooding, and the property manager didn't know where the water valve, the
Mm.
water main is. That's just something that needs to be built in. Like whatever keys to the building that one person had needs to be, transferred over to the next leader and instructed on which keys work for which doors, right? Like that type of leadership preparedness. Is your facility prepared? Do you have tarps? Do you have an automated water valve shutoff system? What do you, that type of stuff. Communication, we've talked about. Evacuation plans. Do you have a meeting point if something were to happen to your church? Is there a meeting point that's communicated where folks can be reunited somewhere in the community? Community needs and outreach plans. How do you support your community partners when they're impacted? All of our churches have a variety of partners. Let's not forget about them. Let's not forget about the neighborhoods we serve in times of disasters as well. And then to plan, practice, and evaluate and update. If you've got a plan you haven't looked at in 10 years, it's time to dust it off and to update it and to remind folks about it. So pick one, anywhere between 1 and 3 things in these areas that you feel like is a strength and it can be stronger, or it's absent and it should be present in your church. And then before we go, I do want to talk about post-disaster support. Obviously, this is an example of pre-disaster support. We want to give disaster preparation, support as much as possible. I read a statistic somewhere that every dollar you spend in preparedness will save you $6 to $7 if you're just trying to respond to an event. So if that speaks to your church leadership, let them know that it saves you money to be prepared. And so this team, Ben, Jen, Sandra, John, they have all the tools that they need to come and talk to a session, talk to a property committee, talk to whoever's running the church to say, here are some things that we can do together to do the preparedness. Disasters happen, and we've got lots of resources on the other side in the immediate and in the long term. So Lori, is there anything you want to say? If something were to happen, how do you want churches to notify the presbytery?
If they have a communication plan in place and a point person, that point person, please give us a call. After flooding and hurricanes and things like that, we divvy up the list and call the churches down there too. So we'll make contact just to see how people are.
And I will say that, like, even if it's not a hurricane level disaster, we had a church in Mercedes that had an HVAC fire, and I think Ben, you were very helpful and
Yes.
talking to them because it was, a rebuilding process, getting in touch with your
Right.
insurance, which can be overwhelming. I had a Korean church in Oklahoma that didn't know what to do with their insurance money, didn't know how to interface with their insurance. They waited months and sat on this money that was sent there because they just didn't know what the first step to recovery was. So if a church is feeling that, please reach out to us. We can talk to whoever and help them take those baby steps towards recovery. Ben, did you want to say anything about that?
No.
So things like that. I had a church in Dallas that had all their HVAC stolen from the top of their roof. So, and they're like, "Oh, we didn't think to call you." I'm like, "Well, you don't have to," but if it's helpful to know that you're not alone, this is what we're here for. So the synod, reach out to me on the synod level. PDA is our national office. Your monies, when you support PDA, it all goes back to churches. It all goes back to churches, whether you're giving out supplies to emergency responders. So say your church opens its doors and you've got teams of disaster relief folks staying. That grant money can go into feeding them, feeding the community, paying your electric bill because it went sky high after hosting people for weeks on end. So there is an initial response grant that can go out to presbyteries. It has to be signed off by the presbytery, so you have to go through Lori. But those grants are available for anything you want to do to support the community. And then there's also a separate grant for church damages. So if your church has some damage from, and this is where it does need to be either a name stormed or an act of arson, which unfortunately does happen. I had two churches recently who said, "Oh, I didn't know I could ask for this money because it was an arson." And so that we do have money set aside for those events. And then there are long-term grants. So this is something most people don't think about. You know, Hidalgo County has long-term recovery. If you've got Presbyterians who are sitting around that table, long-term recovery tends to support those folks who have a harder time recovering. They don't have enough insurance. They had no insurance. They're renters. They don't have a deed to their home. You know, there's all kinds of issues that come up. The Long-Term Recovery Committee tends to identify folks who are having trouble accessing resources to recovering. And this is where our national recovery grants can support that long-term recovery here. Hurricane Ida, we lost 50 homes in the bayou. We got money to not only rebuild homes, but also to train disaster case managers that are based in the community, because the paid for-profit company that was given money to do disaster case management after Hurricane Ida in Louisiana processed 0 claims. So those
Wow.
are the types of creative things we could do with national recovery grants that come out of Board of Pensions. Really quickly, the other things is your ministerial alliance. I was just working with a group in Guthrie, Oklahoma. The Presbyterian Church is really small, but in small towns, you know the Baptist pastor, the Church of Christ pastor, the Lutheran pastor, and if you work together, we can do more together. So look at to your ministerial alliances, your local state emergency management. FEMA is changing, and we don't know what that means for us, but just know that FEMA it may not be what we're used to it being. And so that just means, to me, it means that we've had an opportunity to be there within 4 people when all these other agencies are evolving in their response. Any final questions?
The Corpus Christi cluster is meeting Thursday, and there's a church down there, Senton Presbyterian Church, that would like to offer its building as either a staging for down there or storage of supplies. I talked to Ben about this on Saturday after the general council meeting. I don't know what to say about that. Who should they contact? Ben or, okay,
But yeah, Ben or I tend
okay,
to join the VOAD calls. And this is where we can communicate that
okay.
resource.
Yeah, they just have they have 8 members, but they have a building with several Sunday school classes and that kind of thing. And, you know, they were talking about storing, you know, the buckets and being a staging area when something happens and that kind of thing. So they have the space. They also have funds. That's why they're still going and blowing for now.
Well, and I will say, since we have pretty much depleted our bucket supplies, if they
Yeah.
want to buy new supplies and make new buckets, right?
I mean, yeah.
I'm looking to Jen, right? I think
Yeah, I will work on something that we can put out in the Mission Presbytery letter about how to put this together, because instead of asking people for individual, like, you bring some trash bags and you bring some sponges, churches don't have to pay sales tax. Buying in bulk means that you can buy more supplies cheaply.
That's
So we're
right.
going to try and get some resources for churches to say, this is the best place to get the supplies, and this, you know, get people to make a donation, purchase the stuff, come together. It's a great service project to
Good,
put them all
good.
together. And we've already identified churches in all 6 regions that will store the buckets if your church does not have space.
Jennifer, can that be published who those churches are in each region,
Yes.
so we would
Yes,
know?
Yeah,
absolutely.
we'll put that all together. I'll work on that.
Great. That's great. Thank you. Kathy, there's one thing that we started doing when with the Oklahoma City bombing, when people were just devastated and needed something to do, but we didn't know what to do, at a distance. We were in Houston at the time. But one woman suggested, why don't we and we had these sort of banners on the wallpaper, and we picked 13 churches in the right around there. Most of them were Presbyterian, but not all. And people just wrote notes and we rolled them up, mailed them. So we started doing that anytime, well, not every shooting it got, but Sandy Hook, I can remember we had a table with just paper out, and people wrote prayers and thoughts. It's just something, it's a way to respond from your heart. And eventually, of course, money and those kinds of things. But for that immediate Sunday after some disaster, that's been a very important part of our ministry. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out. It gives people a way to, besides praying in worship or praying separately, and we used to get actually letters back from some of the churches saying, thank you so much. They didn't feel so alone. Sandy Hook in particular, I remember.
That's beautiful. Yeah, there's no shortage of ways we can support each other from near or far. And so thank you for offering that reminder. There is also curriculum for working with children and families that have survived disasters that we can, if a church is doing VBS, you can also offer some sort of grief camp or potluck supper where families and individuals have that opportunity to gather and remember. Ferncliff is a camp and conference center in Arkansas that had a 25th reunion for a middle school shooting. And so the kiddos who were a part of that shooting brought their kiddos together. And it's just a really wonderful opportunity, I think, as a parent, to teach our kids about the value of community, that we'll get through anything that this life brings our way as long as we have each other. So
Yeah.
I'm going to make myself cry. Well, thank you all. I'm just so appreciative for your time. You have a phenomenal task force. I will tell you, not every presbytery has people like this leading the charge and caring for your churches and caring for your community. So kudos to your task force and your presbytery leadership for just being so engaged in this area. Please be in touch if there's anything we can do to support you, support your congregation. I'll send out links to your presbytery's website is very robust. It's a little overwhelming to me, but there's a lot there. So I'll send links to that, send links to the synod. We've got some easier plans on, where to start if you don't know where to start as a church, as well as our slides and other information. But thank you for your time. I'm gonna call on Lori because Lori always sends out beautiful prayers. Could you close our time together?
Sure. I'd be glad to. Holy God, we pray that we will make preparations for things that don't happen, and that we will be your servants who will reach out with care and with love. Thank you for this moment. Thank you for Kathy and her ministry, and for the task force in Mission Presbytery that has been so meaningful and so effective. Go with us tonight in your peace. In Christ's name, amen.
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 Thank you all.
Thank you,
Kathy.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Good evening.